Enregistré. Ah, super.
Okay.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to start. Thank you for joining us
Débat sur les bâtiments,
and adding your
avec
expertise to
la
this
direction climat de Climate Change.
session on building, on the building sector. I want to thank the interpreter for
Nous permettre de nous comprendre
her help in helping us to understand both the English and the French language.
is also available in English. Click on the globe down the screen and don't speak too fast. Ne pas parler trop vite pour lui faciliter la
Yeah,
tâche.
thank you for not speaking too fast.
Alors moi je suis Amaury Parel,
I'm Amaury Parel. I'm the coordinator for the observatory at Climate Change. Climate Change is an organization, international organization, founded in 2015 prior to the COP21, seeking to support non-state actors in their fight against climate change. We have several tools which we are using. The first one is to inform people. We have an online portal, both in English and French, with a mapping of the project, a library of climate, and also planning. The second pillar of our action is to mobilize the actors, and every year they gather during our African regional summits or during our virtual workshops. And the third pillar is to analyze with the help of the observatory, which is reporting its annual report per sector of emission, to analyze the various actions of civil societies, companies, the private sector in all of these different sectors. We have two topical reports also, which are published, and also study cases. This is part of a cycle of a restitution of this report with this following question: has COVID-19 accelerated or hampered climate strategies in the building sector? This is what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to hand the floor to Gila, who is a consultant for climate energy, and we have been collaborating with him on
Merci
this.
pour cette
Thank
introduction.
you for this
Donc là,
introduction.
je vais commencer tout de suite par vous présenter
I'm going to
les tendances
introduce
des
the
acteurs
new
non étatiques
trends
dans le secteur du bâtiment.
in the building
Donc en
sector
2019, et
in
l'action, comme Amaury l'a
2019
dit, l'action du Covid, l'impact du
because of
Covid
the
sur ces
19
actions.
and the impact.
Donc commençons tout de suite avec les tendances de fond
Let's
dans le
look at
secteur
the
du bâtiment en
trends in this
2019
building
avec l'évolution
sector in
des émissions
2019
récentes.
with the
On avait observé entre
new
2013 et
emissions. In
2016
2013
une
and
stabilisation des
2016, there
émissions
was
du
like a
secteur.
plateau
Mais
of
depuis,
the
ces émissions
emissions,
sont
but
reparties à
since
la
then,
hausse.
this has
En
been
2019,
rising,
elles ont progressé de
plus
2%. Et le
1.9%,
secteur
almost
aujourd'hui
2%,
représente
and the
28% des
sector
émissions de
now
CO2.
is
Là,
about
je parle de
28% of
l'usage
the
des bâtiments.
CO2 emissions. I'm talking about
Donc
the
la
use of
raison
the
de cette
building
hausse, la raison
sector.
première,
The
c'est que
reason of
les
this
gains
rise
d'efficacité énergétique
is
que
a
nous avons
gain
aujourd'hui
in
ne compensent pas
efficiency,
en fait la hausse de la surface
which do
construite
not
et surtout
compensate.
la hausse de la demande en électricité. Sur le graphique de droite, vous voyez en fait sur la
And on the
ligne
right-hand
rouge,
side, you can
les émissions
see
totales et la ligne rose, qui
the
est
total
importante,
emissions,
c'est les émissions qui sont liées à nos usages électriques.
and those
Donc
that
c'est
are
surtout dû à
connected
l'augmentation
to
de la consommation
appliances and cooling. So
énergétique
it's
pour
due
les
to the
équipements
increase of
électroménagers,
energy
ainsi que pour
consumption
la
for
climatisation.
appliances and also for
La
cooling.
climatisation, malheureusement, aujourd'hui, c'est
Cooling,
20% de la
unfortunately,
consommation
represents
électrique du
about
bâtiment, c'est
20% of
8,5% de la
electricity
consommation
in the
électrique
building
mondiale,
sector.
et c'est un secteur qui est en pleine progression.
And this is on the
Pour
rise
ce qui est
still.
des impacts du Covid
Now,
sur le
regarding the
secteur,
impact of
on aura forcément
COVID-19
une
in the
petite baisse des
building
émissions cette année,
sector,
mais qui
we've
sera
seen a
légère par
slight
rapport à la baisse globale,
decrease or
puisqu'on
decline,
aura
which is
une
actually
baisse de la
very
consommation en
small
fait, dans les
because
bâtiments
we've seen a
tertiaires, et un
decline of the
report sur
consumption,
les
and yet
bâtiments
this has been
résidentiels.
reported
On a même
onto
vu au
the
moment des
buildings.
confinements en France une
During the
légère hausse de la
lockdown in
consommation
France,
électrique dans le
we've
secteur
seen
résidentiel.
almost a
Donc
pause
ce
in
que ça
the
montre surtout, c'est que
electricity
la pandémie, en fait,
level, but pandemic has
va impacter
revealed
notre usage des
that
bâtiments.
it is going to
Certainement plusieurs
impact
d'entre
the
vous
way
qui
we
sont
are
aussi
using the
en
building.
télétravail dans leur salon,
A
dans
lot
leur
of us
chambre,
are
en train de
working
regarder
from
sur
home in their
Zoom.
bedroom, in their
Donc
lounge.
c'est l'un des impacts. Le
This
second,
is
c'est que
part of the impact. The
les
second
investissements
one
cette année
is
en
that
2020
investment in
sur l'efficacité énergétique du
energy
bâtiment vont
efficiency
baisser.
has
Ils
gone
sont
down
estimés à moins
by
10% cette
10%,
année.
minus
En
10% for
revanche,
this
point
year.
positif, c'est que le
However, the
secteur
good
n'est pas du tout
point
oublié,
is
loin
that
s'en faut, par les plans de relance.
this is
Vous
not
voyez sur
been
ce graphique
forgotten by
les
the
plans de relance et
recovery
les montants
plans.
qui sont
The
alloués par les
recovery
pays du
plans, as
G20
you can
au secteur
see, and the
du bâtiment.
amount of
Donc,
money
au total, on a 28 milliards
allocated
de
for
dollars
this,
qui
we've
sont
seen
alloués. Et
28 billion
le point
of
très
dollars
positif,
for
c'est
the
que ce sont des
recovery plans. The
investissements qui sont
positive
majoritairement
plan,
verts et
the
qui
good
vont
thing about
favoriser
it is
la
that
rénovation,
it's
surtout
towards
en France,
renovation,
Royaume-Uni,
especially in
Allemagne et
France,
Canada.
in the UK, in
Nous
Germany,
passons
and in
doucement à
Canada.
la rénovation.
Now moving on to
suivante.
the
Alors aujourd'hui,
renovation and the
la rénovation, les
retrofit
taux
of
de
building,
rénovation sont encore
the
largement
level of
insuffisants pour rester
renovation
dans
are
les clous
not
de l'accord de
sufficient
Paris.
to
Le taux de
remain
rénovation à l'échelle mondiale
compliant to
est
the
inférieur à
Paris
1% de la
Agreement.
surface
It's
construite
under
par an.
1%
Et
of
on le
the
voit dans tous les pays développés. Et je pense
built
que
area.
M.
We
Sapoval
see this in all of
expliquera
the
bien mieux que moi tout à
developed
l'heure.
countries, and I'm
On a
sure
un sentiment,
Mr.
par exemple,
Safaral will tell us more
de passoires
about
thermiques en
it.
France. C'est un bâtiment sur 6. Enfin, ça concerne tous les
One
pays.
building out of 6
Donc
in
les
France is
raisons
concerned.
principales à
So
ce
the main
faible taux de
reasons for this
rénovation, tout d'abord,
low
c'est une absence
rate
de
of
code
renovation
du
is an
bâtiment, des
absence
normes
of the
énergétiques
codes and the
qui concernent les
norms,
bâtiments
energy
anciens et la
norms for
rénovation.
old buildings and for
À ce manque
renovation,
d'action au niveau national,
and
on
a
a
lack of
une action
national
qui est
action.
très forte du côté des collectivités locales, donc des
It's very
villes.
strong on
Dans le
local
rapport de cette année, on
governments
cite
in
plusieurs exemples, par
cities.
exemple la
We
ville de
can have
Tokyo, qui a mis
several
en place un
examples,
système
like
de cap and
Tokyo,
trade sur les
for
émissions,
example,
ou la ville de New York, qui a
or New York
un code du
City,
bâtiment très
with a
strict.
local code
Je
that
vous ai
is
mis en
very
exemple
strict.
une carte, une
Also, to give
cartographie
you an example, on this
des
map, as you can
collectivités
see,
américaines, donc des villes et
various
des
local
États,
governments in
qui travaillent
states
sur la
and American
transparence des données
cities that have been
de la
working on
consommation énergétique
transparency
dans le but
of
de favoriser
energy
la rénovation.
consumption to
Le second frein
facilitate
que l'on voit,
renovation. The second
c'est un
thing that
manque
we've been
de
noticing is a
coordination et une
lack of
difficulté pour les usagers
coordination
d'accès
and a
à la
difficulty
rénovation
for
énergétique.
users to access
Certains usagers se retrouvent dans une
energy.
véritable jungle avec des
Some
multitudes d'acteurs, une
consumers
multitude
are
d'actions,
very
de
confused about the
possibilités et
various
d'aides.
actors, the
Il est
various
parfois difficile de s'y
possibilities,
retrouver.
and sometimes it's
Donc, de
difficult to
nombreuses
find your way
collectivités ont
around it.
mis en
Many
place des
local
guichets
governments
uniques, en fait,
have
un
put one-stop
interlocuteur unique
shops
pour que
with only one
l'usager, le
person
propriétaire,
for the
puisse
user
avoir
or
accès à
the
toutes les
landowner
informations
to
pour
be
bien
able to
rénover
have
son
access
bien.
to all the
Les deux
information.
tendances que l'on
Now, the
remarque
other two
dans la
trends which we
rénovation,
have noticed
enfin dans le bâtiment existant,
within
c'est
the
une amélioration
renovation sector is an
des certificats de
improvement
performance
of
énergétique
the
qu'on connaît en France
energy
comme
performance
comme
certificates,
les diagnostics de performance énergétique,
or
pardon.
what we call
Et donc
diagnosis of energy
une transition,
performance,
enfin, on
and a
observe tout d'abord qu'il
transition. We
s'étend dans d'autres pays du
first
monde,
noticed that
on
this is
observe maintenant au
happening in
Brésil pour les
other
bâtiments
parts of
publics,
the world,
mais
in
surtout
Brazil,
on
for
voit des
example,
réflexions
and
évoluer
we've noticed
sur
the way that
comment
people are
passer
changing
plus
in their
d'informations par ces
mindset,
dispositifs
how
et vers une
we
transition
use these
vers des
devices to
passeports énergétiques du
communicate
bâtiment, une sorte
towards
de carnet de santé du
renovation
bâtiment qui
passports,
fournirait
to
bien
have
plus
like a
d'informations
health
et qui serait plus utile.
notebook for the
Et
building
enfin, une
sector.
autre
And
tendance que l'on
then
note dans le
lastly,
rapport,
another
c'est
trend which we have
une
noticed
accroissance de
is an
l'attention
increasing of the
accrue au
intention to
comportement des
behavior
usagers,
change for
parce qu'il est
energy
inutile en fait
efficiency,
d'avoir un
especially
bâtiment bas
with
carbone
consumers.
si
It's no
l'occupant met le
use
chauffage
to
à
have a low
25 l'hiver.
carbon building if the
Donc je vais passer
consumers
maintenant
do not
au
change their
bâtiment neuf.
behavior. Let's move on
On
now to
a
new
la même
buildings.
difficulté que
We
pour
have the same
le bâti existant.
difficulties
On a déjà
than with
une
the
absence des normes
older
au niveau
buildings. We
national.
have a
On
lack.
a 2 pays sur 3 qui n'ont pas
Two
de code
countries
énergétique
out
du
of
bâtiment
3
mis en
do not
place.
have
Donc
a
c'est un
energy
gros frein
code,
déjà à
so
avoir
that of course is a
bâtiments,
big
un bâti
obstacle
efficace.
to have
Et une fois de plus,
energy
ce sont les
efficiency.
collectivités locales
Again, the
souvent
local
qui se
governments and
substituent à
local
l'action nationale
cities substitute
par
themselves to the national
différents outils. Ça peut
governments
être
through
des
various
outils
tools,
normatifs,
could be just
des
normative
codes
tools
municipaux
or
du bâtiment. Ça peut être des
municipal or
incitations à
local
l'installation de
codes
panneaux
to
solaires photovoltaïques,
encourage
de toitures
people
végétalisées, etc.
to use solar
On a
PV or
également
green roof,
de la
etc.
fiscalité
We also
incitative que l'on
have
note
a tax,
principalement au Brésil. Par
Greenland
exemple,
value
la ville de São
tax, for
Paulo,
example, in
elle a mis en
Brazil,
place
in
un
Sao
abattement
Paulo,
de la
which
taxe
put
foncière
together
pour les
a cap
propriétaires
and
de
trade
bâtiments qui
system,
respectent les niveaux
or for Greenland value
énergétiques.
tax for those who
Ce qu'on observe également, c'est
respect this. We've
une
also
transition
noticed
un petit peu
a transition
de la mentalité de penser
and a
uniquement en termes
change of
d'efficacité
mindset in
énergétique
terms of only
vers une
thinking in terms of
efficacité climatique.
efficiency,
C'est-à-dire au-delà
towards
de
also
prendre
being more
uniquement en
climate
compte l'usage du
oriented or
bâtiment et de sa
climate
consommation énergétique,
minded,
de comptabiliser également
to
l'énergie
also
grise du
take
bâtiment
into
et
account
tout le carbone
all
qui a été
kinds of
inclus dans la
energy and
construction.
embodied
On sait
carbon.
tous que les
We all
matériaux de
know
construction, à savoir
that
le
building
ciment, le verre,
materials
l'acier,
like
sont des matériaux qui sont
steel
très
and
énergivores.
glass,
Il faut donc
etc.,
prendre
use a
le
lot of
secteur dans
energy. So we
sa
need to
globalité.
take the whole
Et
thing in
de ce côté-ci,
account, into account.
on a beaucoup d'acteurs privés qui se
We've had
mobilisent,
many private
notamment les certifications
stakeholders who've
volontaires.
been
Donc, par exemple,
mobilizing
la certification
for
LEED
voluntary
qui a été
voluntary
actualisée et qui prend
actions,
aujourd'hui en compte
and also taking into
carbone au long du cycle
consideration the impact
du
of the
bâtiment.
carbon in the building
Et enfin,
sector.
une autre tendance qui est intéressante,
Lastly, another
ce sont
trend which
les
we've noticed
réflexions
are
de divers acteurs, que ce soit
the
des concepteurs, des
multi-stakeholders
architectes,
initiatives, whether
sur
they be
la recyclabilité du
conceptors,
bâtiment, qui est un
designers, or
secteur qui
architects,
génère énormément
to
de déchets,
facilitate the
ainsi que sur la
transition to
réversibilité du bâtiment. Donc,
recyclable,
quand je dis
and
réversibilité du
reversible
bâtiment, c'est penser un
buildings. What do
bâtiment
I
qui
mean
puisse
by that?
s'adapter
Is to think of a
à nos
building
usages,
that could
qui
be
puisse transiter
adapted
par
to our
exemple
own use and could
d'un
be
bâtiment purement
used
résidentiel,
from
un bâtiment
one
tertiaire, et
residential
vice-versa.
building to
Et
become
enfin, le
more
dernier
of
aspect que l'on traite
more of an
dans notre
industrial or
bilan cette
occupational
année,
building.
c'est
Another aspect
l'accès à
is
l'habitat
the
durable.
access to
La prochaine
sustainable
slide.
housing,
On a aujourd'hui
sustainable housing.
On a aujourd'hui
And
plus
access
d'un
to
milliard de personnes qui
sustainable
vivent
housing,
dans des
more than 1
bidonvilles ou dans
billion
de l'habitat informel.
people live
C'est
in
des populations qui sont
informal
surtout
living
en Asie du
conditions,
Sud-Est ou en
especially
Afrique
in Southeast
subsaharienne.
Asia or
Et le point qui
sub-Saharan
était préoccupant, c'est
Africa.
que même avant
And
la
the main
crise,
point of
on avait une
concern was that even
progression
before
du
the
taux de la
crisis, we
population
could
urbaine
see
qui habitait
a
dans ces
growth
habitats
of the
informels.
population living in
Et
that
ce que
kind
l'on
of
note, c'est que les
housing
critères environnementaux ne
conditions.
sont souvent pas
Now,
pris
the
en compte
environmental
pour ces
criteria are
communautés,
not
ni pour
often taken into
l'accès aux logements sociaux
consideration, nor
par le
even
pouvoir
for
public,
access to
et que souvent
public
ces
housing.
déficits au niveau
And
national
therefore, there is a
substituent
lack
l'aide au développement ou les initiatives
which
locales. On a
is
noté de nombreuses,
substituted
par
by
exemple,
help
dans
to
les favelas,
housing
de
in
Rio.
the favelas, for example,
Et cet
in
accès
Brazil. And this
qui est
access
déjà
to
critique,
sustainable
cet accès au logement
housing,
qui est
which
déjà
is
critique,
very
va
critical
être encore
already,
va s'empirer
is
avec la
becoming
crise
even
actuelle.
worse,
On
or
note
has
déjà des
become
indicateurs
worse with
forts sur
the
la
crisis,
difficulté
current
d'accès
crisis.
accrue
We've seen
aux
an increase in the
modes
difficulty
de
to
cuisson propres,
access
ainsi
to
que
even
l'accès à
clean
l'énergie avec
cooking and even to
solaire en réseau, par
off-grid
exemple.
solar
Il faut savoir qu'on
energy.
a aujourd'hui dans le monde
Today in
37%
the
de la
world,
population, de la
37% of the
population pardon,
population
qui aujourd'hui cuisine encore au bois.
is cooking
Donc
on wood.
pour conclure très rapidement sur le
Now, to
secteur du
conclude
bâtiment,
on the sector of
c'est
the
un secteur
building,
dont on parle
it is a
souvent moins que
sector
le
which
secteur
we don't
de
often
l'énergie ou que le
speak
secteur du
about a
transport,
lot,
et
not
qui
as
pourtant
much as transport
est un
or
secteur qui doit
energy,
être
yet
absolument traité
this
dans le
sector
cadre de la
needs to be
transition
tackled
énergétique,
as
qui
part of
représente une
this
bonne part de nos
energy
émissions,
transition, because
et où
it
aujourd'hui
is
l'action est
releasing a lot
encore
of the emissions,
insuffisante. Alors
yet
le point
action has
positif
not been
de la
sufficient in
crise,
this
ce sont
sector.
ces plans de relance
Now, the
qui vont
good thing
favoriser
with the crisis
les
is the
rénovations énergétiques, qui
stimulus
vont créer de
plan and the
l'emploi par ailleurs.
recovery
Et le
plans to
point très
create
négatif que vous
employment.
évoquez, c'est
And the other
cet accès au
negative
logement qui devrait être soutenu
point is the
dans les années
access
qui
to
viennent.
sustainable
Je vais
housing.
repasser la
Now I'm
parole à
going to
Amaury
hand the floor back to
et
Amaury.
à Conception. Ton micro, Amaury.
Merci Guilain pour cette
Thank you,
présentation.
Gila, for your presentation. You have just seen
Enseignement du bilan
the
2020.
teachings in the building sector for the year 2020. Now, to facilitate this discussion, we have Conception Alvarez with us. She's a journalist at Novetic, and she will be facilitating this roundtable discussion with Yves-Laurent Saint-Pauval, who is the Senior Advisor for the Directorate for Urban Development and Landscapes at the Ministry of Environmental Transition, and Oliver Raff, he's the Executive Director for the Building Performance Institute in Europe. And then we also have Elisabeth Chege, who is a chairperson of the Kenya Green Building Society. Okay, hello everyone. Hello Amaury. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon for talking about buildings, the building sector, and the impact of the COVID-19. I'm going to now start with you, Yves-Laurent Saint-Pauval. In France, one of the main impact of this crisis has been to start on renovation. This is one of the main gain of the stimulus plan, with about 7 billion euros for this renovation plan. Could we say that this is going to help catch up with the delay that we've had in the past? Will this boost the France to catch up?
C'est souhaitable, évidemment. Le retard est malgré tout relatif. On est
Of course, this is all to be balanced, to say that, yes, we are far from our goals. However, the situation is still progressing fairly well. Just to mention, first of all, that maybe for today we could just talk about the renewable energy, etc., which is a different question altogether, not quite directed to the building sector. What we know for now, and I'm here not just as a Ministry of the Transition, but also as the coach of the Global ABC, which is a global alliance for building and construction. And you can find the link in the chat. What we know, however, is that the building sector is the sector where you cannot pursue the dream of doing as we used to do in the past and to simply replace this source of energy by a renewable source of energy. In any case, we will have to make great efforts on the renovation and the construction to reach the climate goals. The International Agency for Energy has said so. Now, regarding France and the impact of the COVID more specifically, everything that has been said in the introduction is true. We've seen the changes that, which will be long-term changes, more likely. The changes that we've seen will be important changes in the way we will be using energy in the future. What we have been doing and the recovery plan, the stimulus plan, the European stimulus plan and the French stimulus plan is a huge effort for the renovation of buildings. It's important that we should mention this. It is really renewing this topic, and there is a desire for a better quality of living, a better quality of buildings, also due to the lockdown. As you said, 7 billion euros, 4 billion for public buildings. The rest is split between private and social housing. It's a lot of money, and it's probably going to create a lot of jobs, even delocalize employment. Now, there's a lot at stake, which is the training of the companies. Will the companies, the firms, be able to achieve this, technically speaking? The second challenge is the visibility of financing. You know, in France, we do have a system of advice, which is very performant in many regions, in all the regions. There are advice available for both individuals and companies. Now, the issue of the visibility of finances has made progress, and also we've been making progress on the renovation of building apartments, and we know this is not something that has been done sufficiently in the past. But we are all convinced that it is absolutely key that there should be more renovation overall. However, this is costly and it's not easy to implement for households. We should be able to give strict figures and show what kind of savings can be made after the works have been done, and that's another challenge. And it's a very sensitive issue. We have difficulties getting exact figures from companies to commit on the amount of saving that families will make. However, there are some good experiences and good examples which we could share in the chat. That's what I could say for this first question. Now, regarding what is our assessment on this, unfortunately, it's not everywhere that we've seen local authorities taking over the national authorities. This is mainly true in the US, a little bit in France, but overall, generally speaking, whether it be federal states or non-federal states, usually this is mainly managed by the states themselves, and so is the management of energy, which is why we need to continue to act for states to get on the move. And the last thing to be mentioned is that this topic cannot make any progress without any consensus with multiple stakeholders, with looking at the chain from the beginning to the end for all to take part in this transition, the suppliers, the elected members, the consumers, the clients, etc. This is what we're looking for at Global ABC. This is what we're trying to implement, and this is what France is also trying to implement through its new Thermal Transition 2020, which is more focused on the life cycle of the building. And we're really heading towards this with the embodied carbon. We know that about 70 or 80% of carbon emission is including, sorry, I'm just being too passionate and I'm just getting too long now. We'll be moving on to Oliver Raff. The Green Deal you mentioned has had a good part in the renovation plan. Also to create new jobs and to stimulate the economy, and we hope that it will also stimulate renovation, which is really what is at stake, especially in developing countries, even more than sustainable building or construction. What are the levers, Oliver? What are the levers which are being used? Maybe you could tell us about some good pupils, the good European examples, and how have they managed to reach good rate of renovation in an efficient way, that is.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to contribute to this very important debate. Your question, who is a good pupil in Europe, is a very difficult question, but I will try to answer it nevertheless. I think if I can describe the situation in Europe just briefly. As was said before, the big challenge in Europe is the renovation of the existing building stock. And the European Green Deal and the attention the European Commission has put on renovation as a key strategy, not also for climate change and energy, but also for the economic recovery and the economic growth, definitely helps. But the reality in Europe is also that the current renovation rate is only at 1%. And those renovations, the deep renovations, which achieve at least 60% of energy saving, are actually only at 0.2. So that's very sobering news. On the other hand, we know that the future European budget and the recovery funds, which will be made available once there is a political agreement on the EU budget, are enormous and are of a historical size so big as we have never had them since the Second World War. And that is an opportunity which the European member states cannot miss to channel the necessary investments into the renovation of the building stock. And if I look at who's doing better or worse in the EU, which country might be leading, well, it's very hard to point to one leader, because there are a lot of countries which are innovative in addressing one barrier to renovation or another barrier, but there are not many countries which have a truly comprehensive and effective strategy in place to renovate the building stock, with one exception maybe. The member states had to develop a national renovation strategy, which had to be submitted to the European Commission by last March, so 9 months ago. And we analyzed the strategies which were available right now. Actually, only half of all the member states have submitted that strategy to the European Commission. So we analyzed all the strategies which are available, and we found that literally only one was complying fully with the requirements, and that was the Spanish long-term renovation strategy. Many of the others had some really good chapters in it, but also some really poor chapters. And I think that's the problem, that we don't see a strategic approach to renovating our building stock, to renovating individual buildings or renovating whole urban quarters, while at the same time making sure that the carbon content of the heating and cooling energy which is applied to the building goes down at the same time. On the other hand, as I said, I see a momentum, I see an increasing political will to address the issue and to solve the issue, but we urgently need to speed up. The IEA today also launched a very important report. So today seems to be the day of report launches and everything is coming together, which is fantastic because it gives us a lot of opportunity to discuss. Fatih Birol said this morning that energy efficiency investments are slowing down globally. And of course, that's very bad news because we need to go in the opposite direction. We need to accelerate our change. And that is not only true in Europe. And I know, of course, many other countries on this planet have very different challenges. And I think what we need to come to is a common understanding that when we build new buildings today, in particular in emerging economies, that these buildings should actually be zero carbon buildings, meaning they have a very high efficiency level and they use renewable energy to cool or heat if necessary, but to provide only renewable energy to the buildings which are newly erected.
Thank you, Oliver. C'est une transition parfaite pour nous.
Thank you, Oliver. That's a great transition to now turn to Elisabeth Chege, hello, hello. You are the chairperson of the Kenya Green Building Society. You're going to talk about Africa, where most of the construction of the future have not yet happened. So everything will have to be built in the sustainable way. Is it something that is already happening in Africa, in the willingness to do so? And how has the crisis, the health crisis, impacted? Has it accelerated this willingness or hampered the willingness to include the climate issues in the building sector? Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today to share some thoughts around this. So yes, I am the chair of the Kenya Green Building Society. I'm also the vice chairperson of the World Green Building Council Africa Regional Network. And we've had an interesting year like everyone, but we've learned to pull together to actually get us to where we need to go around buildings. So pulling off from Oliver, very good remarks around all new buildings must be zero carbon, because that's the opportunity I want to talk to today around Africa. So we currently have the buildings that will exist and the cities that will exist in 2050 are currently being built and are yet to be built, or they're being planned to be built. So adaptation and mitigation around the targets we have and actually being ambitious gives us the best opportunity. We also know that Africa has the best climatic region. So coming back to passive design, and there was a launch of the roadmap for buildings by the Global Alliance of Buildings and Construction in conjunction with the World Green Building Council, which also gives us a very common benchmark of communication. To date, we've had a lot of silo efforts around Africa. Good things have happened, but we actually need to collaborate more to get further, faster. So also noting that Africa has 70% youth. It's a very youthful continent. We note that the discussion around green jobs around the construction industry comes into play. So capacity building, skills transfer, this is the right time to do it. And one thing we've noted through COVID as well and the pandemic, when flights stopped, the construction industry stopped, not just because of COVID itself, but also we're importing a lot of materials into Africa. We're a consuming continent. So that has actually halted the whole idea of why are we consuming rather than creating industries that from the onset can actually be energy efficient, employ this youth, and also target the net zero carbon that we are discussing. So some of the successful initiatives and interventions I'd like to mention are also beyond the roadmap, is that the financial sector has started listening. And this is from a lot of advocacy work. To date, we realized we were speaking to each other in the technical capacity, but we weren't going as far as the financiers to showcase that they can actually invest responsibly. And it does make a huge difference in the building sector. So with that, one of the aspects around the targets for affordable housing, which is part of the Big Four agenda in Kenya, because we have a deficit of 2 million affordable homes, is that the affordable homes themselves that are going to be built, 2 million of those and more by, as we speak about it day by day, there's more of the deficit, gives the biggest opportunity for us to capture that transition and head towards sustainability. So this year in 2020, there was a decree from the State Department of Housing that the minimum standard that shall be used for affordable housing will be IFC Edge. And with that, they receive free land to develop this. You might ask, why IFC Edge? Currently, the building code in Kenya is still under review. And this has been the case for quite a few years. The developers and the private sector is not stopping. So what we see as a Green Building Council is that we become the center of standards that can be used, especially targeting towards net zero or efficient buildings. And that's one of the cases. So the impact of COVID, as you've mentioned, is that health and well-being has become the center of the conversation, especially in the construction and building sector. So the World Green Building Council launched the Health and Well-being Framework in Africa as well this year. And the opportunity with that is that health and well-being was foreseen as a future added benefit for green buildings. But that being the center of it, people realize that green buildings and sustainability puts people at the core and the planet rather than profit. That's a huge change on the impact of sustainable buildings. Secondly, by being able to work from home, we've definitely reduced a lot of emissions, but over and beyond that, it has allowed us to collaborate and transcend beyond our barriers that we had between countries. So we've seen a lot of collaborative effort around Africa, and we actually implore the AU to be part of this discussion towards zero carbon buildings in Africa and the cities that are going to be built. The last point on this as well is that the sustainable built environment being included in the center of discussion about recovery allows for the finances being allowed to be used for COVID-19 recovery to directly align to low carbon buildings, sustainable buildings, health and well-being at the core of it, and definitely not leaving behind the urban poor, where we saw the biggest numbers of COVID issues. And that's where we also see the biggest numbers of climatic change effect. Thank you. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Elisabeth. On va continuer sur la question des
Let's continue on the issue of the lever,
qui est une question clé.
which is also another key question for reaching our goal. If Laurent Sapoval, according to you, what would be the most efficient lever? Would it be for a greater implication, obligation with more norms and codes? It's slowly changing in France. It's something that is difficult to force. Is that the main challenge, would you say?
Votre micro, je crois. On ne vous entend pas. Alors, je crois qu'on a perdu Yves Laurent.
Voilà.
Ça y est, ça y est.
Donc, je vais redire tout haut ce que je disais.
Okay, I'm going to say out loud what I was saying before. For the great majority of the buildings in the world is being built without any rules, any thermal rules. There might be constructive rules, but no thermal codes or rules, which of course is a huge challenge and a huge topic. We've worked a lot on incentives. Financial incentives, of course, are important. But technical incentives are also important, giving people the opportunity of knowing what they need to do, how they need to do. These are technical, complex technical issues when it comes to renovation. Often it is more complicated with less framework, less architects or less engineers. So these are some of the key levers. There's another one, which is a lever of communication and awareness. Without an awareness, no one is going to want to do this work, building works efficiently. However, in our opinion, the issue of the framework and the rules, in order to see far, in order for companies to adapt, you need to have ambitious rules. If people don't show, if the government do not show what are the rules and regulations, and companies will not produce the necessary materials for the production, and the whole chain of value will not be able to adapt if there are no obligations and regulations that are forced. So I believe that public policies, which should be at large, whole policies, in order to be efficient, should take in account both the obligations and the willingness. But in France, for example, we had a law of obligation for building, for renovation, and for thermal renovation. which is embedded renovation, we call it. This kind of obligation is an obligation that could lead to some long-term results. In a similar way, these obligations could also lead to some changes in the market. Now, if there are obligations in the new building sector, now during those changes, the cost of the change will take into account the obligation for renovation works. So when the apartment buildings change owners, the cost of the renovation could be taken on board or could be included in the price of the transaction in the real estate. So I would say that political powers are powerful drivers, but the commitment of the private sectors are also key. The whole of the private sector, the label sector, the financial sector, the necessity to have a certification, etc. These are all ways to make things improve. However, public policies should be, in my opinion, the main agents or the main actors of transition, which would also answer the other challenge, which is finances. Of course, this is very costly now. Oliver, how about what would you say about the European on the European level? What are the levers which are used to lift all these barriers to boost the energy transition? Should there be a stronger?
Should there be a stronger? Sorry, I didn't get the end of the question.
I was wondering what levers are used in Europe to boost renovation. Are we going towards more rules and regulations and obligations, as if Laurent was saying in France? Is that the case also in Europe, and how to lift the existing barriers?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, the recent renovation wave strategy, which was published by the European Commission, proposes a long list of actions. I would really call it an action plan, a very strategic document. And in my opinion, there is not one silver bullet point to overcome the many barriers which we have to renovation. We need regulation, yes. We need to have very clear regulation. We need to have ambitious regulation, but we also need to make sure that this regulation is properly implemented. And it can only be implemented if the construction sector as such is receptive also. And that also means that we need to speed up innovation in the construction sector. Earlier today, we released a new report looking at how the construction sector can contribute to achieving a much strengthened European climate change target. And we came to the conclusion in the scenarios which we modeled and which we created that we really need to increase the renovation rate for deep renovation, those renovations which really achieve a high saving of energy. We need to increase that by a factor 10 to 15, which is an enormous challenge. And it's not going to happen overnight, but that's the reality if we want to meet Europe's greenhouse gas reduction targets. That's just the reality. And that means that we need to have a transformation of how the construction sector is delivering renovation activities. And that again requires innovation in the sector. So we need the regulation to stimulate the sector, but we equally need to channel innovation funding, innovation support to the sector so that the construction sector can really transform, improve its business, its service offer to renovation, push out industrial scale solutions to renovation, and make sure that the renovations deliver the energy savings which they're supposed to deliver. So it's not it's not one solution, one silver bullet. We need to have a whole package of solutions. Another very important solution is the question how we overcome the financing barrier. And at the moment, we're essentially asking millions of Europeans to make an investment decision to invest in their buildings. And that's okay, because many of the European homeowners will have the financial means to do that. But there's also a large group of homeowners and apartment owners in Europe which don't have the financial means to invest into the upgrading of their home. And these are the groups which need to have a different kind of financial support through different financial instruments, maybe through higher grants, or maybe by allowing third-party investors to come in and invest into the building over time, which means in the end we need to develop more innovative financing instruments, and we need to roll them out, and we need to create a mass market for these innovative financial instruments so that the different investment abilities of the owners are met. And of course, an individual person who just owns a home has a very different investment ability than a large real estate company which holds portfolio of many apartment buildings or many office buildings. So we need different financial instruments for these different groups, and we need different policies which trigger a response from these different groups. That's very, very important.
Est-ce que ça avance selon vous? Est-ce que tout ça
Do you
est
think this is moving forward? Is this being implemented? Is this going to speed up? Is this going to speed up with the Green Deal? We hope so. Are these levers already activated?
I definitely think that we see progress in some countries. It's not a mass market progress yet, but we have a lot of, in particular, in some European regions, also in some French regions, we have good pilot projects and good regional initiatives which really try to stimulate a mass renovation market. And the challenge which we see is to move from pilot projects, from lighthouse projects, from small regional scale to a large scale, to a scale which covers all of Europe, and which makes sure that the policy innovations which are made in one region or by one stakeholder group are shared across the sector, are replicated, and are scaled up. And that's the challenge which we are not mastering well yet. It's all good to have a nice innovation here, but we need to make sure that we roll it out to a mass market and really push innovation out into the mainstream business offer.
Thank you, Oliver. Elisabeth Tchéguet,
What about you, Elisabeth Tchéguet?
Vous vous dédiez à la certification
You've been dedicated to the certification of low carbon building in Kenya. Is it a well-spread practice in Africa and a practice that is developing fast? This is one of the levers to speed up renovation. What is the situation over there for you?
So the situation here is very much not renovation, but new building. And the capacity we have with new buildings and the new cities is much greater, and it's urgent. And it stems all the way from socioeconomic factors of having people learn what that is. So on the ground for the last 10 years at least, awareness has been a big aspect. So first of all, we developed the technical capacity. Second, we realized the technical capacity goes not just with the private sector, but the national and local governments as well, because they can't write policies if they don't understand what the policies are for. On that basis as well, there's also the, I mentioned about the finance element, and we have now embarked on the discussions with the financial sector for their awareness, to show that the impacts they have is that they're either part of the solution or part of the problem. Being part of the problem is that you allow investment mortgages that will develop buildings that actually emit carbon emissions while we have the greatest opportunity. There has been the myth that, yes, if you go towards net zero, it's going to be more expensive, or you need a lot of innovation and we need to go back to the drawing board. But we haven't used all the tools available yet. Even if it was beyond not looking at certification, looking at basic passive design principles and looking at what we have locally, we have a lot of opportunity to actually capture that. So while we're working on the policy elements that have been mentioned, there's a big drive to actually say where we're sourcing the finance should actually come with a caption that this is what the development should meet, and this is how the socioeconomic factors should be aligned to it, so that we're not also building the slums, informal settlements of the future, and trying to tie all these elements in. The second aspect that's been captured in the roadmap quite clearly is the first thing we need to do is not look at buildings one building at a time or one community at a time. We need to look at our urban planning. When were they planned? Is it sporadical growth of cities because of urban population? We need to take a step back and look at our spatial alignment of our countries, our cities, our counties, to say if it's in the path of the climatic effects. It's easier to do it now than later to align the urban planning to suit net zero buildings that are going to be built, while at the same time we look at the cities that have been built already.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Je reste avec vous. On a une
Thank you, Elisabeth. We have a question from our participants, from our listeners. We have a few minutes left. If you want to send your questions in the chat box. Another question which we just had for Elisabeth and Oliver. How is the environmental impact taken into consideration during the building of a construction? In France, we had what we have: avoid, reduce, and compensate in case of a building project. Do you have similar rules or similar measures in Europe and in Africa? First in Africa with Elisabeth. Do you have similar measure?
Definitely. We have acts of parliament that require you to have the environmental impact assessments carried out before you develop. Now, implementation of that, as mentioned by Oliver before, is another issue. One thing I normally say, and we've seen on the ground here, is when you're targeting to build the green buildings, if you follow the national regulations for environmental impact assessments, you're 70% there. So with the basis of implementation is the act that we really need to take control of. And this also links to urban planning, because the impact assessments will allow you to build in certain areas because of how the town has been planned and for future development. But if we really look at our biodiversity, which has now also come to the forefront in collaboration of nature-based solutions, and those cooling solutions actually coming from the nature-based solutions rather than artificial, where we have energy consumption, we're seeing a collaboration in that, but a lot more has to be done. As much as we have those laws, the implementation can definitely be improved.
Thank you, Elisabeth. What about Europe, Oliver?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Well, I mean, of course, in Europe, when it comes to spatial planning, we have environmental impact assessment and all these things as well. But what we do not have regulated significantly is essentially the carbon content, which is related to constructing a building, to erecting a building, or the climate impact, which is caused when demolishing a building. The EU has announced that it would like to develop regulation in the future on this, but we don't have it yet in Europe. Again, I think the World Green Building Council has done quite some work on that topic, on embedded carbon as well. Elisabeth, I'm working closely with your colleagues in Europe on that topic. And I think the EU has a lot to catch up on this topic to make sure that we reduce the overall carbon footprint, the overall climate impact of buildings. It's very important to reduce it during operation, so through energy efficiency, through renewables, but we also need to make sure that the carbon footprint of the building materials is significantly reduced. And I also agree with what Elisabeth said earlier, we need to be smarter with passive design. With the passive solutions, we don't need to have a high-tech solution for each and every problem. By creating properly and smart designed buildings, we can reduce their climate impact from day one. And I think that's also very important.
Thank you, Oliver. Une autre question de Myriam.
Thank you, Oliver. Another question from Miriam. Would it be relevant to imagine a green label for a real estate financing in the same way that we do for financial products? How efficient would that be? Or Oliver or Yves Laurent regarding the label, the real estate labels? A great number of existing labels are efficient in that the people ask for them. This is on a voluntary basis, which is a good way of doing this for people who see far, but not for everyone. I would add to this that in France, we have been working and we are working on this, and we will soon have a technical regulation taking into account the whole life cycle of the building. And I think this is this kind of regulation, rules and regulation that we need to seek to develop. We have produced it in France, and I think this could be done elsewhere. Now, there are many places, especially in developing countries, when you work with local material, traditional know-how, where you could also manage, even though it might not be easy to measure, you could manage to still develop in a less costly manner, in a performing manner, energy-wise and climate-wise. I hope I can say a word of conclusion, but I will stop here for now. Oliver, over to you. Would you like to say anything about the green labels?
Yes, thank you. I think it's essential that consumers have the right information about any product they're buying. And of course, buildings and homes are one of the purchases which most people make only once in their life. So it's essential that they have all the right information about that. In Europe, we have a system to label the energy performance of buildings through a good labeling scheme. And that covers a relevant part of the information, but it doesn't cover all of the information, which is important when making a purchase. For example, the energy performance certificates, which we have in Europe, do give very little information about comfort levels or indoor air quality in a given building. And therefore, I think that the existing system which we have needs to be reformed. We are involved in a number of projects on that. We are making suggestions. We're testing them on the market to find out what is really relevant for the citizen, because the labeling system needs to work for the citizen. That's the target group, and that's most important to meet their needs. So I see a big opportunity to reform and to evolve the existing system to increase information for consumers.
Thank you, Oliver. Avant de terminer et de conclure,
before we conclude, I'm just handing the floor back to you in a few sentences, a few words. What would you say about this synthesis or the report, the annual report from climate change in the building sector? Elizabeth, would you like to start? Just a word of closing.
Sure, thank you very much. I think the report is quite apt, and it's timely to actually have it. We've had a lot of reports come out that are silo efforts, but this has captured the element of the developing nations and also, Africa. A lot of the figures are very relative, all the way talking to the move to residence, working from home, and looking at energy, not just electricity, but also the cooking energy that before was coming from firewood, and seeing that there'll be an increase in that. So linking the whole climatic issue around it. One thing I'd like to add, especially around the Africa Regional Network, is that through the Green Building Councils, if those who are listening, they don't have one, they can create one and be part of these efforts, because a lot has been done already, and we will definitely be using this report going forward. Last chance to say this before the year ends is that we definitely need a built environment day at COP26, because buildings need to have the spotlight that we're giving here. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yves Laurent, maybe, and Oliver for finishing. Votre micro, Yves Laurent.
Yves Laurent, le micro.
Okay, your mic, please.
Quelque chose un peu rapidement. Oui, d'abord, le rapport est
Quickly, yes, the report is very important. It gives an overview, not just in the building sector, but elsewhere.
à la présentation d'aujourd'hui.
For those attending today's presentation who are more specialized in the building sector, it would be important for them to read the rest of the report. It's really full of helpful information and it's a very great quality. The other thing, when I hope that people who have participated today will realize this, realize the necessity to act quickly and early enough. Buildings are built for over 100 years. If we are building good buildings today, this is what we're aiming at. The third thing is that this report helps us realize that the energy efficiency of the building is also important, strategically and socially speaking, because better quality buildings will mean less expenses for families and households, for also the states, which is why I'm linking this to long-term strategic choices in terms of energy saving. The energy that is used, whether for renovating old buildings, this energy is not being invested in the industries or in the new technologies. This energy, at the end of the day, is lost to change the air temperature. So it's key that states, governments making their energy choices would facilitate the energy transition as the first solution. The last thing to be said is that the design, the conception of this report is based on a partnership, on collaboration. Global ABC and climate change are both based on a partnership. We will not make things change without involving all the stakeholders, all the actors, from the planification of a project until the end of the building, through the management and the use of the building. And I would also connect to what Elisabeth was saying, to have a special day during the COP26 that would be fully dedicated to the building sector. We did this at COP21, which is when we developed the Global Alliance for the Building and Construction. It's 30% of gas emission, and this technical aspect had never been taken into consideration before. This is why we are fighting and at climate change and at the global ABC and also in the green building councils. We need to have this topic at the core of the climate issues.
Thank you. I think the report really reminds us again how important the building sector, the built environment is to mitigate climate change and to address the challenge of climate change. And at the same time, it reminds us that the COVID-19 crisis is refocusing our attention on buildings. And I think we have all become aware how important it is to have healthy buildings and energy efficient buildings and buildings which simply fulfill and meet our needs as human beings anywhere in the world. I think that has become very clear in this crisis. And therefore, I think it's also important to remind ourselves all the time that any decision we are taking today about an investment in an existing building or about an investment in a new building locks us into a carbon rich or a carbon poor pathway. And we know that we can only afford a low carbon, a carbon poor pathway if we want to fight climate change and avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And therefore, I can really only endorse Elisabeth's and Laurent's call that we need to bring this topic to a much higher level of attention at the climate change negotiations as well. And of course, a buildings day at COP26, I'd be happy for us to be there and contribute to the success. And I would like to thank Climate Chance for putting this very important report together, and also for the very clear messages which you have in the report and in the way you present it. So thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, everybody.
Merci beaucoup à tous.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
I also want to thank our partners, private and public, by sharing with you. So, voilà, merci à tous. On vous donne rendez-vous demain pour nos derniers débats sur les déchets et le textile. Tomorrow we have
Tomorrow.
the last talks of climate change on waste and textile industry. So thank you again for everyone and see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Oliver.